Today, we're exploring finding motivation in unprecedented times, which is certainly where we're at the moment. We're joined by Alison Smith, who's a core member of the future purchasing team. She's a really experienced procurement professional. She's a superb trainer and a coach, and she's a published author as well. So, Alison, do you want to help us with our motivation?
I'd love to help you with your motivation. What I'd like to ask you is, if you imagine that picture was taken middle of November, the water temperature is about 6 degrees, which is about 47. The air temperature is freezing. There is ice on the sand. I've walked past cars with ice, frost all over them. If I was to see your videos, I wonder how many hands would go up about how motivated anybody of you would feel about doing what, and it is me in that there picture. How many of you would go, yes, really motivated, infused to go into that cold water, Alison? That was done at a time when I actually wasn't wearing wetsuits at that point. I do now wear wetsuits a lot earlier in the year. To a lot later. So there's only about 4 months of the year in Scotland when I don't wear a wetsuit. But it's interesting, even when you look at motivation for doing the same thing. If I look at my friends that I go swimming with, we all go swimming for something different. I go swimming for the connection in nature, and that's why I'm quite happy to get up early in the morning. I think the earliest I've gone in the water is about 6:15 in the morning, but it's always for sunrise because I just love that connection with nature. A lot of my friends who swim would not be motivated to get out of their warm beds, whatever time of year it was, to go swimming. But they'll go swimming when I don't, because they'll go swimming because they want to go for exercise purposes, or some people for mental health purposes. So they might go when they're struggling. It's like, oh, I need to go for a swim to shift my thinking. So even for the same thing, this is a reminder that we all have different motivations for doing it or not doing it. So some of you will be motivated to not do it for various reasons as well. So that's just something to remember. In terms of what we're going to cover on this session, there's 2 that I'd like to mention very quickly, and one thing that I'm going to spend a bit more time on. The 2 that we're going to touch on are the language you use to describe your goals and the energy that you have available to do whatever it is you want to do, and then to look at the values. But the first thing to note is motivation is an inside job. You can only inspire others' actions. You can't motivate them. Now, that sounds pernickety. However, just think about the difference of when you say, oh, I need to motivate somebody, versus, oh, I need to inspire somebody's action. The tonality is different, and the sorts of words that may come out of your mouth when you're thinking about motivating somebody versus inspiring them are very different. So, yeah, pernickety perhaps from a linguistic point of view, but worth remembering that motivation, we can only motivate ourselves. We have to inspire others to be motivated to do something. However, I'll forget that and I'll start talking about motivation as if we can motivate others throughout the process. So really, this webinar ought to have been called about inspiring others' actions rather than how to motivate. So really touch on language. When I did a 5-day mindset challenge last year, one of the things the first thing we did on day 1 was to think about the language we had about a goal. And I thought that was just going to be day 1 activity, and that day 2 we'd look at things that stop us, from doing things that motivate us, etc. And we'd work through the week. But what a lot of people found was there was huge insight in the fact that their wording they had for their goals was not motivating them. The goal itself was motivating, but the language they were using was having the opposite effect. And this picture is a reminder for me about when I did that about my book. I remember having my hair done and somebody saying, oh, how long have you wanted to write a book, Alison? And my hairdresser said, she's talked about it for 15 years. And this was when I'd eventually got this published. And the reason that I share this picture is that, well, there's two reasons, but one of the things is the fact that that is where I wrote the book. So bearing in mind that I said earlier about being motivated by nature, doesn't come as any surprise really that as soon as I started writing the book, I mean, it is about nature anyway, but nevertheless I started writing it in nature, then I couldn't wait. So where shall I go today? And oh right, I'll go and sit on Kirkcaldy Beach and write the book. But the other reason that I've share this is that when I said I was going to write a book, that wasn't motivational because it was too big. It didn't mean anything. My hairdresser, 15 years she's talked about it. It was only once I chunked it down into, oh, I'll write the index. Oh, wow. And I got very excited about what am I going to put it in it. Start writing the introduction. Oh, yes, I'll write the introduction. And that's what then inspired my action from then on. So if you're not motivated, or those your teams or stakeholders are not motivated, sometimes it might be because the language you're using is not helpful, and it could be the fact that you're actually making it sound far too big. And at this precise moment, people are wanting to know, and lean thinking would also suggest try and say, what can we do this week, or what at least can we do in the next 2 weeks? Rather than going, well, writing a book's going to take you years, isn't it, Alison? It's too big a process. So the language we use is important. I love this model. Those of you that are on the call that have trained with me know I love this model. So this model suggests that, well, I suppose maps out that we are either competent or incompetent about things that we do. And it's not a digital yes, no, there is a scale, but nevertheless, we're either competent or incompetent. But actually, that competence can either be done consciously or being done in the background. It's as if we've got programs that once we've learned something, we move into that unconscious competence and we can suddenly drive for 3 hours and not even have thought about it. Or that people can knit a whole jumper without even looking at the pattern and have had a conversation with something about something else really meaningful. So things that we learn, habits, become habits, and then they go into our unconscious. The problem is, as Mr. Miller suggests, is that actually that conscious awareness, that our desktop for our head, if you will, can only actually have between, his little magic number is 7 plus or minus 2. So you can only have 5 to 9 sort of stimuluses sitting on your desktop. And at the moment, we've got more than that going on just to deal with the lockdown. I mean, how many of us ever used to think about consciously about washing our hands? What about going for a walk? Going for a walk, we could have a nice chat. I might be able to write my book. And now you're walking along thinking, oh, there's somebody coming towards me on the footpath. Oh, we're going to be 2 meters apart. Oh, what happened? Oh, there's a car coming. How am I going to know what? And suddenly all that desktop in your head is used up with, all of that thinking. And therefore, how, if you look at what that person there is juggling with, how can we fit in all the rest of the stuff, the business as usual stuff that we need to be doing for work? And God forbid how we're going to fit all the lovely new stuff that's come out of the way, because procurement has been asked to do, to go the extra mile in order to help organisations have what they need in order to provide the services that they do. So our bandwidth is busy, and therefore you may not be getting the response that you expect from people, and it's purely because their energy is being sapped doing what ought to be background noise. Now, I think we've got a question, haven't we? I do think in the poll about energy, I'm hoping.
Let me pull that one up for you.
Yeah, so how much energy, I'm just wanting to see how much energy do you have available for work? Oh, isn't that a lovely distribution curve?
It is, yeah, absolutely.
Well, a lovely distribution curve, but actually we're heavily slanted more towards less than usual. Well, not heavily, but we're slanted towards the half as much or less than normal. So nobody's admitted half as much, but nevertheless less than normal.
Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Good.
So that is a wonderful example of the fact that some people are going to be really coping at the moment, and some people are going to be struggling purely on the amount of energy and space they've got available in their heads. So as managers and for ourselves, we need to be taking some of those things off our to-do list and going, is this a priority now? Might it be something that I can do later? Because let's concentrate on the priorities.
Exactly. Yeah.
So language is important. The bandwidth, the energy that we have available to us is important. There's another model, and it's by David McClelland, and it suggests that, can you all see this now? Sorry.
Got that, yeah.
Yeah. So what this model suggests is the fact that we're either motivated away from something. So you might be motivated away from wasting money, or away from conflict, or competing objectives, or wasted resources. So there's things that we don't want over here, and then there's things that we do want over here, so what we're moving towards, and that might be increased control, improved results, teamwork. But they're very different. If you imagine finance, I suspect they're going to see wasting money as being an objective that they have, and yet if you look at marketing, they might want better, use of their money, so that their budget. Now, you could say that they're the same thing, wasting money, improved use of the budget, but they're very different. And actually, what this model suggests is that we need to be very careful that we're not using language that people find demotivating. Because certainly when I do this as an exercise in workshops and don't allow people to use towards language and say, no, I want you to focus on what we're moving away from, is that all of this creeps in. All of the away from, all the towards stuff creeps in. Because I think, although research suggests that 40% of people are preference for away from, 40% are towards, and 20% are both. Well, let's try that second poll, shall we? We've got a second poll where, have I given you enough to think about whether or not you're away from or towards? Are you more focused on what you want to reduce, move away from, eradicate, get out of the situation, or are you more motivated towards where you're headed?
You're talking really about the language here, aren't you? In terms of, if we think about a particular situation, do I feel I'm more likely to express it as I want to get to that future, as opposed to I want to move away from this past?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. No, that's a nice distinction.
So here's the poll, just to get a sense of where people are. So again, the choice here is: do you feel typically when you're thinking about projects, do you feel that you want to move away from particular things? Do you tend to express yourself as moving towards things, or is there a bit of both going on? Do you find yourself using both sets of language? Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
it's interesting. It is certainly what I see in workshops, in as much that a lot of people feel more comfortable with the towards language and selling category management, procurement using towards language. The interesting thing, and we won't do the poll on it, would be, where do you think your stakeholders are? because certainly audit would be perhaps more away from, because that, you know, risk is more away from, finance quite often might be more away from. So what happens quite often in our lives is that, for the want of any other information, we assume everybody's like us, and therefore we give people what we ourselves want, and therefore we start talking in towards language more than away from. Now, this is always relevant, and I've used this in workshops for years because it's a useful model. I think this is more relevant now because Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we're not going to go spend a lot of time on that model, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs is about basic survival being a prerequisite of having love and belonging and development. And at the moment, a lot of people, certainly those that haven't got jobs, people who've got family members who are ill, etc., have been forced down into, it isn't about what they want in the future, because people aren't looking that far in the future. It's what they don't want to have happen.
Yeah.
And therefore, if we're talking to stakeholders, we need to be mindful of the fact that, and test it. I'm providing an outline, a different way of thinking possibly, and test it with individuals. Some individuals are not affected by what's happening, and if what you say to them normally works, then I wouldn't suggest you change what you're saying. But if you're struggling to motivate somebody and don't know why, then what is it that they're really worrying about that they don't want to have happen in their working life or even in their personal life? And I suspect if we throw more in, I mean, the interesting thing, I laughed when I suddenly realised that we'd sold this webinar on the basis of finding motivation rather than unmotivated. You know, how to get people, how to motivate the demotivated. It's sort of like we're wanting to actually focus on the unmotivated bit and not have them unmotivated. But we were sort of focusing on, oh, we're going to have everybody motivated.
So I was just thinking about a procurement issue that we often see is, if you imagine trying to change a supplier, then there tends to be a lot of enthusiasm in some parts of the organization for that supplier change, and there's actually a whole bunch of other people who will resist a change, and sometimes that's because the away from isn't clear enough.
Absolutely. Yeah. The biggest question is, what is it that you, I mean, the interesting thing, I'd perhaps go around it the other way, but what is it that you get from your current suppliers that you're worried about you won't get?
Yeah.
So it's what is it you don't want? Well, I don't want them to let me down. I don't want, so it's all of focusing on that to then be able to go, so if I give you that, are you happy that, that you'll consider an alternate supplier?
Yeah.
Definitely. The interesting thing on in this model, and I'm hoping that you've come with me. Have you now
good.
got it on negative and positive?
Yeah, got that.
Is the fact that, I mean, I know my PA and I know a colleague did this, is it's really easy to fall into the language of, but the away from's negative language and the towards is positive language. And no, because actually what you're telling me is not wanting to die is negative and wanting to survive is positive. Now, they're the same outcome, but they're worded differently. And it would be very interesting to assess the different countries in the world about which way they've focused. And has the languaging that they've used around, we don't want the population to die versus we want the population to survive, in what way that has impacted the behaviours of the inhabitants within that country.
Yeah.
Because they're not inherently positive or negative, other than a person with a preference, it's positive. To them, not dying is positive. Well, I can't think that it wouldn't ever be, to be fair, but I can understand how it's easy to fall into, and I think that's why we do it. We focus so much on that towards language because we see what we're moving away from as being negative somehow, as, oh, I don't want that. And therefore we convince ourselves that because we don't want it, we don't want to talk about it either. And at the moment, I think talking about what we don't want in an organisation and being able to say, if you don't want that to happen, let us help you, is going to be so much more powerful than turning around and going, oh, we'll give you something lovely. See, I can't, sorry, I'm being cynical. But, you know, it's that whole, oh, it's lovely in 6 months' time. It's all going to be rosy. It's like, actually, I've got real problems now. I've got weeds now. I just don't want weeds. We'll talk about the flowers later. You know, the roses don't come out till later in the year, but I've got dandelions now. Yeah. So just help me get rid of the dandelions. There's another element of this model where, so we've gotten away from it and towards going on, but if I was to ask you, Mark, and assess what you're motivated by, we could, you know, in a coaching session, I could ask questions and we'd come up with, I don't know, 7 or 8, a hierarchy of 7 or 8 values that would explain the majority of your actions in work. Things you would do, things you wouldn't do. And that's true for all of us. We've all got a hierarchy of values that are what are the criteria, if you will, that determine whether we will or won't do something. Now, the problem is that I don't know what your values are, Mark, and you don't know what mine are, and we don't know necessarily all the time the values of our staff. And the other thing is that that I get quite angry about is that some coaches will say, well, here's a list of values, tell me what you're motivated by. And the problem with that is that you then end up with a lovely aspirational list of, I would like to be motivated by those words, like some organisational value statements. But anyway, let's not go down that route. So what McClellan did was say that on the whole, all of those values can get categorised or segmented into one of 3 areas: achievement, affiliation, or influence. So achievement, somebody would be motivated by results, by goals, by success. Whereas somebody motivated by affiliation, it might be more about teamwork, or not working in silos, or harmony, or avoiding conflict. Influence might be more about having control over the process, or control over the people, or not being controlled by people. So in fact, let's try the next and final poll. And the poll is just simply inviting you to think about, but based on, I appreciate a very limited explanation of what they are, but which of those 3 motivates you the most, would you say? Are you more motivated by achievement, by affiliation, or influence?
And this is like a steady state situation, just where we are on a regular basis. Yeah.
Oh, look. Sorry, for those of you that are not on, as a host, we can see as you're going in, and so the blue lines change. So I'm just reacting to, oh, that's nice.
Okay, here we are.
Yeah, cool. So what we're suggesting is we've got, and this is what happens in business, that a larger majority are motivated by achievement, and we've got equal motivation by affiliation and influence. The interesting thing is that quite often what you'll find is the achievement, those of us that have a preference for achievement, and that's not me to be fair, will use achievement language and think that that's going to motivate the 40% that are suggesting here that they're motivated by different things. And you'll actually get people reacting because the other 40% will be looking at the achievement game, but they're not listening to me. It's not relevant. Why are you not, you're not talking my language? Because that's where we're going with this. That because basically what we're suggesting is that we've got 6 different categories or segments that we could be talking to at any point in time. So away from and towards, and away from achievement. So if you're talking to somebody, if you were to put your two poles together and say, is that right? Does it feel right? For those of you that said away from and achievement, does that feel right? If I was talking to you, trying to motivate you to do something, does it feel right that, or sound right, that, you know, you don't want to fail. You don't want to be seen to be ineffective or inefficient or lack direction. Or if you'd said towards achievement, then it's about objectives, goals, etc. It's not to say that affiliators and influencers aren't motivated by visions, and results, but it may be that those results have more of a, for affiliators, more of a people results than a numbers piece. So there is refinement within each of these. I'm doing it very black and white for the purposes of a webinar, whereas actually, for instance, respect quite often comes up. So in workshops, I might ask for examples for each of these 6, and some people might turn around and say respect, and actually respect ends up being each of one of those. But respect would look very different for somebody who has a preference for achievement versus somebody who has a preference for affiliation. So there are certainly behaviours and words that wouldn't meet all of these preferences, but they would mean something different in the person's head.
If I think about a classical category project of some sort, then I'm often driven by finding inefficiencies and ineffectiveness and trying to do something with that and moving away from it. In terms of affiliation, I'm often trying to keep away from conflict, try and keep people on board and operating. But in terms of approach, I'm actually more driven towards sort of control and power and driving. So I can see in any particular project, I'll have a mix of away froms and towards activities, depending on what's going on in a particular element of the activity set. And I guess that sort of mix would be typical for us. There's a point that was raised earlier in the questions as well, which is some of this is going to be also influenced by our individual risk profiles. So how do we, depending on how much risk we're personally prepared to take, that'll change how we feel about some of these areas as well. So that's an interesting twist on how we might judge certain elements and how prepared we are to take risks to move things forward or to abandon things that are in the past.
Yeah, and you know, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, risk may very well be about how secure you feel at the bottom. So the physiological and the safety needs, if we feel more secure at the bottom, then we're more likely to take more risks as we move out of that. Whereas I suspect, I mean, I don't know, but I suspect more people are actually have become more risk averse. Is that right? Is the right way around? The way around. Anyway, don't want to take risks because of the impact that might have. So, you know, a lot of people are now starting to talk about what's going to happen when I go out of the house, and suddenly, oh my God, I can't do that, couldn't possibly do that. Whereas only a few months ago, I would have been quite happy. So I suspect the risk profile will have changed, definitely. And absolute, sorry, Mark.
Yeah, there's another question came up, which I think is impacts right into this area as well, which is it depends on where you think you've got control as well. So for some people, they might think they've got lots of control over lots of areas. Others, it might be that they're totally in the hands of the environment that's around us, and that'll change your perception of
nice.
which bits you can get to. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, I suspect. Yeah, you could map that out, and I think we were talking earlier about this, Mark, that there's an element of all of this is just information. You know, on all of our templates, we've got here's the data at the top.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then the commentary and conclusion, and that's all about the insight. It's like, so what? What is this analysis, this data telling me, and therefore how is that going to inform my action going forward?
Yeah.
So it isn't And it isn't necessarily fixed. So it's like, this is what I think at the moment. If what you're doing currently is working, you don't need to do anything. This is about, oh, I'm lacking motivation, why might that be? This person is lacking motivation, why might that be? This stakeholder's not listening to me, why might that be? And then it's about testing the hypothesis that says, okay, well, I think this, therefore I perhaps need to flex my language. The thing is, knowing where you are in these models enables you to understand why you may be pushing buttons. So, you know, I'm quite an affiliator, and therefore might push buttons because my language is more about well-being and working together. And somebody who's much more achievement focused is going, but I want to know what the outcome's going to be. Exactly. Stop it. You know, you're too much of a mother hen, Alison, which I have been accused of being. But that's because that's them viewing my behaviour from their view. So this is just about, and that's what the next slide's about, is we've identified you know, a template that enables us to start to, I suppose, write down some of those observations in order to develop a communication plan going forward. So, you know, what are the personal goals, business goals, beliefs? Now, I mean, that's quite broad, but nevertheless, are there any beliefs that you think, you know, it might be a belief about procurement, it might be, heaven forbid, a belief about women in business, it might be belief about well-being, I don't know. So any beliefs that we think might impact how the languaging we might use, communication plan. Obviously, they're away from and towards influencing and whatever. There's some other things here that towards the bottom that we've shown because I would in a longer workshop obviously spend a bit of time on those. In terms of, some people have preferences for visual information, some people are quite happy to hear it, some people need detail, some people need, you know, high level, etc. And then
so I guess the piece here is that this is it says stakeholder preference at the top of it. We could use it on ourselves as well if we're needing to understand our own motivation. But the key of this really is it's actually thinking about an individual, which is why the name box is so important. Yeah, we've all come across.
So our name, the individual that I'm going. Now, of course, if we're going into a meeting and it's got a mix of people, then we need to be thinking about covering all six.
Yeah.
You know, so actually you'd be going in and going, I need to be away from and towards achievement, affiliation, influence, and I'm more likely to cover everybody in the room.
Yeah.
Than if I go in and go, I'm going to ignore all that and do what makes sense to me.
I should say we're going to make this this deck available, I think, to people afterwards. So we'll pick up and send copies of this out for anyone who needs to look more closely at it.
And the final slide really, and this what's on this slide will change. So it's a two slide template, if you will, is just about considering where people are on different models. So they're just models that help you understand why people might be acting the way they are and how you might want to change your language or your behaviours in order to assist them in either understanding what you're saying or assist them in being more motivated about what you're asking them to do. So Bolton and Bolton is a personality profiling. Insights might go there. You know, Myers-Briggs, etc. I mean, the interesting thing there is organisations that have done insights as an organisation quite often encourage people to ring up new stakeholders to say, could you tell me where you are on insights?
Yeah.
In order for them to go, oh, right, yeah, you know, you don't need the data the day before, I can talk at the person, etc., etc. Change curve, you know, there's some argument as to whether or not it even exists or not, but as a, you know, denial is a real behaviour that people have to change, as is anger, as is depression, as is acceptance. So irrespective of your belief about the Kubler-Ross curve, then this enables you to say, where is that individual currently with respect to what you're asking them to do? So are they in denial about, I don't know, the lockdown or whatever, or are they angry and blaming others? Because our communication is going to be very different dependent on where they are. Ditto Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now then, where is it? The resilience model is from a book called Building Resilience, and I will add this to the slide deck before we send it out. Building Resilience for Success, and it's a brilliant model that just suggests that there's 4 components to resilience, and it enables you to go, oh, well, is it that what we were talking about earlier about purpose? Is that not so clear? About adaptability, confidence, or social support? And also then, sorry,
those are the headings in each of those circles. It's arguably a little small to read for those of us with more elderly eyes.
Yes, well, I'm struggling. It's just I know the model. So yeah, so confidence, social support, adaptability, purposefulness, and I've done this with a few groups, and we've had different preferences for where they think the issues are. And of course, interesting, I sometimes get different responses from where managers think the issue is versus where the team members think the issues are. But anyway, it's a useful model, and certainly, and anybody that likes models and data and research, then that book is for you. I mean, I'm not that person, but it is a brilliant book that's got loads of research in it. I put there the conscious incompetent, conscious competence type model because it may shed some light. And then actually the conflict one is something we use in the negotiation playbook that we've got, and that's from there that just enables you to think about how does that person react to conflict. But again, where am I first? So what's my preference? What's their preference? What does that mean with respect to a relationship and a communication piece?
I think that's isn't that the Kilman model, Thomas Kilman model?
Yes. Oh God. Yeah. Oh yes.
Conflict,
I will remember to add that. Thank you. I need to add the references. Yes, Kilman. Yes.
Good.
And that's it.
Brilliant. So I mean,
we've got questions.
What we've looked at here, if anyone's got questions, just throw them on the group chat, and I'll pick them up and pitch them into Alison. So we've really looked at the challenge of language, particularly within our own objectives, what we're trying to get to. And you mentioned trying to make them into small chunks and making sure that worked. We've looked at the challenge of the amount of energy that we've got available being eaten by lots of externalities at the moment, which means we've got less opportunity to focus on work as much as anything else, because everything else is crowding in at the same time. And we've looked at some particular models which help us think about the way in which we might be looking at things, particularly the away from and towards model, which is particularly useful language. Got a question here, which is from Graham. Just a thought, which is, if your business is in survival mode at the moment and there's no time to do detailed analysis of team motivational preferences, which
Sorry,
I think we can understand. Is there a way to, what's the best way to frame the challenge so that individuals can find their own way to be motivated? So it's almost rather than trying to analyze people, what sort of, can we present someone with a toolkit and say, have you thought in this sort of way? Well, much as this presentation has done, I suppose, actually, how could we deliver that to a group of people rather than...
I have been asked this question a few times recently, and I haven't changed my answer, but I also am aware that my answer is coming from my own preferences. My own preferences is around well-being, and my sense is that we have to go for the lowest common denominator and assume people are away from and struggling, and therefore asking, are you okay? What support do you need? And the people that don't need it, and the people that are quite happy and loving all of this, will put up with that. They're quite happy. They will accept what you're saying, and actually will just go, I'll just get on with it. And they may not even need much attention. So for me, it's about focusing on that away from language, but then it does sway into my, Amy MacDonald, a friend of mine, runs a company called Head Torch, and they do a lot for mental health, and I've been to a lot of their conferences. And I think at the moment, we've got a lot of people hiding how they're feeling. And therefore, it doesn't surprise me that perhaps where I'm coming from is a we've got people that need help.
Yeah.
And that's our stakeholders as well. I mean, stakeholders
Yeah,
are going to
yeah.
be struggling as well. And it's about, what can I do? You know, are you okay? And
There's an interesting piece there, which is perhaps people aren't fully able to trust in the current environment as well. You know, that worry of a sign of weakness and what that shows. And so the other part would be
yeah,
almost is, if I'm looking at my team, do they trust me to be able to look after them well enough in this environment to be able to share where they need support? Because there's quite a big turnaround for many. But I was thinking about the Weatherspoons example, which was quite painful to watch, where with the payment issues and all of that piece going on. And you can imagine in that organisation at the moment that levels of trust may not be as heightened as they could be.
yeah. Well, having been to a number of well-being and mental health conferences, the biggest thing leaders can do, and I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it, is share their own struggles. So I did, and in fact, I did a workshop with Poet on David White on Sunday, and somebody said, "Oh, what do you do when you can't write?" He says, "You have to start with where you're at. And if you can't write, start with not being able to write." And I think that feels like that leaders need to start with, "I'm struggling," and find something that they're not struggling, that they are struggling in, to be able to say, "I'm struggling."
Yeah.
I'm struggling. I know other people are struggling. In order, so at the conferences, you've got leaders that come in and say, "I'm struggling with mental health," and then you have the workers that come in and say they're struggling with mental health, and both stories are very impactful. But it's about getting people to be brave enough to answer it, and I sort of hope that that's the world we come out at the other side.
There's actually another question here, which is from the other side, which is, if I'm an individual looking at my manager who's throwing work at me at the moment, how do I manage their expectations of what I'm able to cope with at the moment? Because that's a
do I have the answer? I don't know.
That's a biggie.
As a coach, I'd know that how I could do that with one individual. Because that individual, it would be, what can you do? So for everybody, it's going to be different. For some people, it would be that they have to ring the doctor. For other people, it would be they can speak to their boss, or it might be the fact that they have to speak to a mentor who's able to speak to their boss. So I think in a coaching one-on-one perspective, you'd be able to come up with a strategy.
Yeah.
It says, A, how do you feel more able to say it? But I absolutely appreciate that when some of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs going on, that people make decisions in order to still have work. And that's hard, because that's going to come at a price, I would say, of some mental health and physical health. And you only have to look at what some of the here in the UK, the daily politicians, we're worrying now about the added health deterioration outside coronavirus, because people aren't, because we've got the mental health issues and some things being exasperated, and also people being fearful to try and do something about it. I don't think that answered the question, but quite happy to talk to that individual if they have an issue about that separately, because it's much easier to apply to a specific person and situation than come up with a
we can come back with more on that one. That was great. Alison, I'm conscious that we're actually past our time on that one, so I'd just like to thank you very much for the comments that we've got through are fantastic. Everyone seems to be enjoying this deeply. There's a lot in here for us all individually. So that's fantastic. Alison, thank you so much for your input there. Just amazing to explore these areas, and great to get a sense of a set of tools that I guess many of us will be somewhat familiar with, but actually exploring them in a depth that's really useful and makes us think about things in a different way. Superb.
Thank you.